everyone. This is Chris with the TheoTech podcast. We're about to have a conversation about church digital transformation based off of a book that recently came out, a free ebook, Creative Commons Zero ebook that is really presenting a bunch of questions that churches can think about as we navigate this digital transition. And on the call today, I have Professor Michael Paulus from Seattle Pacific University, Pastor Dave Sim from Renew Covenant Church, and Daniel Herron, who is working with TheoTech now too, and formerly was pastoring the Robloxian Christians on Discord, or on Roblox and Discord. So thanks all of you guys for joining today. Michael, you can start off with the context of this book.
Sure, thanks, Chris. So Heidi Campbell is a very productive scholar in digital religion, and she actually keynoted the summit that some of us were involved in hosting as a church digital transformation project back in May. And during the pandemic, this is her fourth book that she's published, open access online book. And this book is interesting because it actually pulls together all of the findings from the three previous books. So this book is called "What Should Post-Pandemic Religion Look Like? 10 Trends Religious Groups Need to Understand to Survive and Thrive in the Next Decade." And so, as I say, this is and it's a very short book. It's 10 trends that are identified with some language around those, sort of explaining them. And then each trend comes with a point to ponder, and those points often include questions. So I found the questions, the points are provocative, and the questions are interesting. So I thought it would be interesting to just ask some of those questions of this group and just kind of see what they prompt in your thinking about the future of the church. So the first point in this book is that religious leaders are being forced to reconcile their concerns about technology with the clear benefits provided by the internet during this time. So that's the trend. The point to consider reads like this: consider the difference in what it means to be mission-minded versus traditional focused when it comes to ministry. And then here's the question: how can you still focus on your mission while being creative in how you incorporate technology?
I felt like, because I'm digital native, perhaps, I felt like it was an odd question to think about, how do I incorporate technology, because I inhabit a technological world,
Right.
and I'm using it all the time for a purpose. Sometimes consciously, sometimes, uncritically, that happens too. And I remember from a theology of technology book from the Garden of the City, there was a joke. It was technology is anything invented before you were 30 or something like that. And when I think of like digital, virtual, and other forms of online church, it's felt like we have already in-person church, we have incorporated technologies already, whether it's TV screens and projectors, audio amplification, a Facebook page. And I think that what may have happened in the past was that we maybe nibbled on some of these tech platforms because the in-person was so much of the emphasis. We just kind of like dip our toes in the water, and it's a little bit like a fad, like, oh, we need to have an Instagram now, we need to have a TikTok now or something. But what happened instead was that the traditional way of engaging people is just wiped out by the lockdowns. And so it ends up forcing, a church to think of like, okay, that stuff that we were only dipping our toes in the water in has to be the way that we do it now. So that's what this question prompted me to think of I don't even know if we got to the point of creativity, other than for my church in particular, Union Church, it was the values that we had for interaction led us to use Zoom basically instead of just live streaming. So we had to be creative in how we used it so that we could maintain some interaction throughout our whole services and stuff like that. But even then, there's more that we could have done. I think it reached kind of just a stable point and stayed there.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely, Chris. I think that when a lot of churches dove into being online after like COVID started, there was like a big push to try new things and to like be creative. And like as the pandemic went on, sort of that ingenuity sort of just stopped because people it was just getting into a routine, and they found what worked or a minimum of what worked, what was a possibly a translation of what they were doing in person, on just like replicating online, and mostly just taking what was happening in person and getting it to people remotely. And once that was achieved, they just kept with it. I think that what's really necessary is for churches to continue to be intentionally creative and to put thought into ways that they can continue to use these platforms, because there has been a lot of benefit that churches have seen while being remote, albeit not in person, and there's a lot of loss in that as well. But I think that thinking long term, there's probably going to be some sort of reckoning at some point that's going to be going to force some sort of continual online presence for churches. And it's better than to figure that out now than to get down the road and have to reinvent.
It's been a definitely transition. Renew's mission is renewed by God for the renewal of our neighborhoods. So kind of in that is, being a neighborhood church, and we had a food bank, we have a community garden going, and different things. We tried to keep the food bank going as long as possible, but we didn't have as many volunteers, so it wasn't sustainable. And so we had to let go of that for the time being. And community garden is still going, but the hope was people would garden together, but people came at different times just to be socially distanced and stuff. So what does it look like? What does it look like to be neighbor in that sense? And then the second piece is there's in our facilities, we have a lot of churches, especially immigrant churches, a Korean church, a Russian church. And, honestly, they're mostly in that we need to meet. This is where we pray. This is how we do Sunday. And getting emails and calls every week, like, are you opening it? Are you opening it? We're still not open yet.
Wow.
So just thinking about that has been difficult, but our leadership taking a stance like this is what it means to be in solidarity with our neighborhood and our community and safety, and what are we going to do now to reach out to connect people. And so in this period, our whole sanctuary has changed. We've taken out all the pews, so I don't know what the other churches are going to do when we get open up again, but we're wanting our space to be more like a community space where different groups, not just church groups, can meet, like a shared space. So yeah, it's changing, and we basically said to people, we're going in this direction, and maybe it doesn't look like you're used to.
That's interesting. That the first question, I think that was meant for perhaps a different demographic, where you have people who were, who had a negative view of technology prior to the pandemic, and and then we're forced to say, oh, actually, there's some good stuff here. And the where I go to church, that was much more the case, where Sundays were like, no, we take a Sabbath from technology. We want to break from technology. There's too much of it in our lives as it is. We don't want to put a monitor up in the sanctuary. So for a lot of people in ministry, that's kind of the first question they have to deal with is we thought it was all bad, and now it's good, and it's actually in some ways great, but there still are theological sort of issues that we're kind of, I think, still sorting out in the terms of the role of technology in our lives. But it's interesting that, back to where kind of Chris started this discussion. It's like, for people of a certain generations, we've the point is made in the book is that most organizations have had to integrate technology into everything they do. It's just they've had to survive as a business or as an organization. The church has been unique in that it hasn't. It's been able to hold on to traditional practices, things that people are comfortable with. Not all churches, you can't generalize, but a lot of more traditional churches. So, but the next question will, you've already started to answer this next question, but so we can kind of keep building on kind of the good stuff you've already shared. But one of the trends, in the book, this is the third trend. The trend is that mediated worship online raises the question: how much of religion is or needs to be embodied? The point to consider is framed this way: if true religion should be the observance of practices grounded in our values, instead of just prescribing to a list of rules, could an online mediated platform provide a new negotiation as to what a faith relationship truly means and looks like in one's daily life? So another way of thinking about this is we've unbundled kind of church in many ways. We're not just focused on the streaming the service or whatever the primary event is on Sunday. So what does that mean for how the church thinks about how it operates, not just as a place, but as a set of practices?
Well, Michael, I was actually just thinking about something similar this morning. So my church on Roblox, for the longest time, it sort of replicated the church service of like a physical church, just in a virtual setting with avatars and like completely online. And I was thinking through the different elements of the worship service, and a large chunk of what our worship is online is our avatars joining together, listening to worship music and praising God in that space. But one of the challenges that I was just thinking about this morning is that on our platform, which is very platform specific, we listen to the music, but we aren't able to see the lyrics necessarily. So if you don't know the songs, you're just sort of hearing these things. So I was thinking about like how much of our worship is reliant on the lyrics of these songs. What happens if we remove, like if we just make this sort of ideal of like changing, like just add instrumental music and offer a space and like set a setting of this is a time to be thankful and to have Thanksgiving and to just share what you're grateful for and give and honor God and give praise in that way. It sort of redefines what worship is, and it takes us out of this like box model that a lot of the church has embraced, and more makes it like personal and really intentional. I think that's just one example of sort of what it could mean to transform what we're doing online. Any other thoughts?
Well, when I think about embodied, my mind, I don't know if this is hitting the question, but my mind automatically goes to things like the sacraments, baptism, and the Eucharist. Like, what does it look like without being physically present? And so I think a lot of churches have had to figure that out and figure out what they think about that. And so I'm fine. I have no obstacles towards, being innovated or adjusting or adapting in that. And we cut around the kind of understanding. We kind of had to a discussion in a worship seminary class at Seattle Pacific Seminary on the Compline service. I don't know what St. Mark's or St.
St. Mark's. Yeah.
Is it legitimate if people don't understand what's being sung or what they're attending? Are the words important? If they're experiencing something, there. So that was a good discussion. I think that's worthwhile to think about.
Interesting.
Related to the sacraments question, I thought it was interesting. It's not a sacrament, but the only passage I could think of in what Jesus kind of taught that's hard to do without being in person was the one, John 13, where Jesus washes the disciples' feet and instructs them to do likewise for one another. And it's just like, well, it's really hard to wash someone's feet virtually or remotely. Maybe one day if we have robots, we could try to do that, but to take it literally. And I thought that was interesting, though, that there's elements that do seem to require embodiment in that sense. But there's so much. I think that the challenge was that we assumed that everything required it. And then now we're discovering that most of it doesn't. Most of it probably doesn't. And it was trending that way. Again, whether it's good or bad, it was already trending that way with like digital curriculum for discipleship and stuff like that, streaming services, streaming sermons, whatever. It was already moving to an abstraction. Even giving is an abstraction, because if true religion is caring for widows and orphans, you could argue that we need to be physically present with those widows and orphans, feeding them and caring for their needs. But most churches have already moved to a model of you give and then we'll disperse the funds through a nonprofit that will actually try to take care of them. So those abstractions have been happening for a long time. And COVID just kind of exposed that so much of what we were already kind of doing could actually be done virtual and remote. There was one more thought I wanted to share about this question about embodiment, because I realized I've been making a distinction in my head now between the, the physical, the digital, and the virtual. And I'm defining the terms in how I'm using them. I got a free TV recently from my sister's neighbor who didn't need it. And I was like, okay, this is something I can tinker with. So it was like an old, like 2008, 55-inch TV thing. I mounted it onto a stand and started to use it. And I realized this is a game changer because it's so huge that like my fiance who's with me, like she can see what I'm doing in the digital space physically because she's just next to me, but we're interacting with this huge surface together, like a whiteboard, let's say, and she can see everything I'm doing and I can see whatever she wants to talk about. She could just point to things with her body and, like, there, what's this? And then I'm going to add a multi-touch to it. I found one on Alibaba, so I can now touch the screen and stuff like that. And I found that that's digital, but it's so physical too. It's both, we're inhabiting a shared digital space while we're in person with each other. And I think the challenge with COVID was that it's not just this digital change, it was this virtual change where we're all trying to connect into a shared space through a little tiny phone screen or a laptop. We got to be close to our cameras and stuff. And so there's like another distinction there where it could be even by changing the mediums that we use to show up, to be present in that virtual space, we might find it to be very effective and powerful for our mission and our ministry. Partly it might be changing the virtual space from being a Zoom gallery of just faces on a grid to being like a spatial thing where maybe we're all little avatars next to a Bible, kind of like in Roblox or something in the space. Things like that could change it. And also physical hardware could change it, where if we actually, help grandma to be joining the service from her TV, she just sits down like she's already used to TV. There's a nice webcam pointing at her and she can just move. She can be however she wants to. She may really enjoy that kind of experience too. That is different than having to hold up my little phone and kind of like look and see what's going on. So I see these opportunities to transform the hardware side and the virtual space side that might really help us to even be quote unquote embodied in the virtual world more than we have been before. And it might be just really interesting what comes out of that.
It's interesting. We have a photographer who photographs the inside of Boeing planes 360, three-dimensionally. And we have a real estate agent. And when we were talking about Easter, we were like, we should just, skip everything we usually do for Easter and just stream the service. They're like, what about an Easter egg hunt, a virtual Easter egg hunt, like a virtual tour of the house? We could do it of the inside the church and hide eggs in the church and actually take people around, and have an Easter egg hidden.
Well, yeah.
So
I mean, Boeing was one of the huge, early, innovators. I believe, if I have this history correct, in virtual reality, for different, business applications. And if you sort of think about, emergent, sort of more immersive forms of reality through, mixed reality, augmented reality, it starts to be. I think what you're saying, Chris, is like this being forced to do church digitally mediated. We stopped. We kind of were, the distinction we had between online, offline, digital really started to break down, because we're still interacting with people we knew. It was mediated. It wasn't face to face. Well, it wasn't face to face physically face to face. It was face to face. We're doing it through these screens, which are limiting, of course. But it really began to complicate this duality we had about, digital, physical, online, offline, when in reality these things are all mixed. They always have been. Digital always has a physical infrastructure behind it somewhere, right? I mean, there's servers and there's network routers and all that. I'm always physically situated somewhere when I'm online. There's just, there's sort of a break there because you can't, see everything I'm wearing. But as a technology, and I think you'll be seeing this soon with Microsoft and Teams, and sort of bringing in virtual reality into meeting spaces. It really does begin to challenge these kind of, what is embodiment? I mean, what is presence? And it'll be complicated even further, but it will really force us to think about, what, how do we want our experiences mediated, and what modalities will these be appropriate or desirable? And then how can we mix them together in different creative ways?
It's interesting about embodiment too, though. Like, I feel like the opposite fear is also true, like maybe an over embodiment, because I find a lot of people afraid to do readings or participate in our streaming worship because of self-consciousness, and that's been an obstacle for a lot of pastors. Like, I can preach to my church right here in the building, but when there's a camera and I'm streaming live, something changes, or I resist that, or, the vanity kicks in or whatever. So it's a weird dynamic.
There's actually there's a trend and a point that go even further into this in this book. This is trend number 8. Moving church online represents a shift in how religious groups see the relationship between the online and offline. The point to ponder says, our current human reality is a combination of offline and online experiences. Religion is no different. And so the question becomes, how can a religious organization help facilitate the online into their offline practices, and vice versa? So I think that's kind of one of the more interesting questions that this asks is, we've crossed a threshold into a more blended, experience of church, and actually every institutional, pretty much everything, but here we can just focus on church. And so how do we integrate these things? How do we integrate these different modalities? How do we, what's important? There are multiple answers to this question. I think it's a wide open thought experiment, but it is a reality most of us will be entering into in a few months, God willing. And actually, just as a sort of a subsequent question to that, if this is a challenge in every facet of our lives, our personal relationships, our professional work and experiences, our personal lives, can the church actually be a leader in helping people think theologically about presence in this blended world? The philosopher Luciano Fleury uses the term on life. Is this sort of mixed, this mixture of online, offline that doesn't really make sense anymore. So can the church help people live well, live wisely in an on life reality?
There's one element that I think we touched on in our CDX content about attention and protecting attention, and viewed from the lens of a spiritual discipline, even of like, how do you pay attention to God? I think forever people have had a hard time paying attention to God, regardless of digital distraction or not, in reading scripture, in prayer, and seeking God's will. And it's not that much of a stretch to then think that as a spiritual community, we can help one another to cultivate attention. And one simple practice that we could do is when we all join the worship service online, if we chose to, in a small community or whatever, we could all just put all of our devices on do not disturb, for that hour or something. And that becomes a ritual that we do together to help one another, to be present to each other and to God, even as we inhabit a virtual space. In a physical space, people will stare at you bad if your phone rings in the middle of the service. And so you already have the social pressure. But in the virtual space, it could be an intentional design. It's a choice. You're not using pressure. You're just saying, hey, everyone, we're coming together because we want to focus on God. And so together, let's go ahead, take out our phones. Everybody take out your phone. Let's put on do not disturb for 1 hour. And then let's do this worship together. That's like one example practice that would help both in in-person life as well as in virtual life. I think that's one example I can think of how churches, by being intentional, by treating the virtual and the digital as a real thing, as a real part of life, you can then apply spiritual disciplines to that too, in the way that you would in physical life.
I think that one of the big difficulties for churches as they contemplate, doing online well, has been, one of the main focuses has been like the worship service, and this 1 hour on Sundays or Thursdays or Saturdays or whenever you guys meet, but I think what's hasn't been given a whole lot of thought, and what's probably more difficult to accomplish is, well, I don't know, just think 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, the neighborhood church was like a hub for what was going on in the community. And it usually has a fair amount of outreach and programs that support the community. As the church shifts online, how is the online church still able to meet those needs and do that effectively without just, as you mentioned earlier, Chris, giving and directing money to a nonprofit that's, doing work somehow? How is the church still able to remain central to that purpose of feeding the hungry and visiting the prisoner and, the whole Matthew 25 or 26 call? How are we still remaining central to that while we think about online?
I think being online has also forced a lot of churches to kind of flip the script on that question, who is my neighbor? All right. And, we've had people visit us during pandemic that, wouldn't have stepped into church or, wouldn't have an opportunity to come to Renew because of geography or distance. But I think it forces people to think about different types of neighborhoods than actual houses and, physical geography, but social and cyber. And one example is, diversity and multi-ethnicity. A lot of people, have been criticized because they have to travel distances to go to a diverse church or a church that's, pastored by someone who looks different than them. But in the online context, that I guess that judgment isn't there. People have felt free to go where they want to go.
And I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges facing the church now, that they've gone online and they've kind of broadened their neighborhood online, but they are still local institutions. So how does a church, hold on to that tension of, it's a locally embodied, situated group, fellowship, but it also is connected to this larger network, of fellowship as well. And, just historically, you build, everything is about the building, what went on in the building, getting people to come to the building. That time is suddenly over, at least that being the only manifestation of church. And Heidi does a really good job of getting into this in her book, Network Theology, where she says, we have to kind of think about, the church in sort of this networked world, and how do we leverage the affordances of sort of this network reality that we're living in. And so that's just a whole different, the church, the local church becomes kind of a portal to a larger, it's a larger experience of the church. And so maybe not only with the dislocation or disruption of space or place, we also have a disruption of time. And so not everything a church does can't be stuffed into and it never has been, but the focus has always been that corporate worship time. But maybe that gets bent or stretched a little bit too. And going to a particular church could mean a lot of different things. You're connected with maybe a local group, or you're connected with online synchronous service or something, but it's no longer just one, manifestation of a church. It's this broader network church.
And it's kind of conducive to remixing, I think, too. But you said it's unbundled now. The church as an experience is unbundled. So I've noticed in the midst of the pandemic, my friend group, my in-person friend group, is not really people who go to my church. It's just other believers and stuff like that. And it's just interesting that they really are my friend group, but Union is still really my church. And it's both. It's remixed. And I may participate in, a small group with some other people, and then I have friendships with others, and then I have worship on Sunday with this other community. And I think the virtual shift has been conducive for that. And it just kind of changes the vision of church as an organization from being cradle to grave, all in one package, get everything you need here, to, this is what's unique about what we offer, and how does that align with God's call on your life? And perhaps that when it does, we can support you in that. And yeah, I think that it's going to take time for that transition to really fully happen, but it feels like it's just moving in that direction. I don't know if anyone else feels that way too, but it's felt that way for me.
Yeah. So my wife is an avid gamer, a hardcore gamer, and she plays ESO online and also Destiny 2, and she's in like high level raids and calling out, leading raids and stuff like that. And so during the pandemic, she's kind of gotten me to play a lot more. So I'm playing Destiny 2. I can only do one character. Some people have multiple tunes, but I'm a one tune man. But we're on chat and or like audio, and it's like being invited to her church. People are sharing with her. She's like the mother of these younger guys, and people are sharing things, and it's been really cool, to be a part of that community. That are connected, even when they're used to being connected, even though they're physically distanced.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because Daniel's perspective comes in from building a church in sort of a gaming environment, and so it's the church can look to a lot of different models out there, for inspiration. And it's pretty generative to think about, how people have built community, in other ways, how people have leveraged the network, in other organizations. that are still kind of, there's especially ones that are sort of have a kind of physical locality that grounds them, and is a primary interface for many.
Mm-hmm. I just wonder, like, the network effects of the internet let you do mass movements in a different kind of way. So recently we had the whole Wall Street Bets group in Reddit that rallied together to do a short squeeze on GameStop stock and stuff. And, but they just rallied so many people that are complete strangers to be activists, quote unquote, individual activist traders that enacted something that would never have been possible without the internet and things like that. And a part of me does kind of like think about, with this virtual church question and stuff, it's like, what kinds of things like that apply to faith?
Yeah.
Jesus had a massive movement, of course, but yeah.
Yeah. Because nobody's ever, I mean, the church historically has always been, well, not always, the church historically has often been at the forefront of sort of new information and communication technologies. You can look at the codex, you can look at the printing press, you can look at this, the steam printing press, and there are others, telegraph, what hath God wrought, but not the internet. You don't see, you see different versions of sort of Christians on the internet, like, the first internet church, or, people creating purely online churches, and people doing evangelism online in kind of discrete areas, but not really leveraging what you're talking about, Chris, which is like, how could Christianity use this platform? I asked once in a talk, it was like, what would Augustine have done with the internet? Right? Or Luther? I mean, fill in the blank. There's tons of them. But it is something that the church hasn't really, it hasn't leveraged this new technology. I mean, it's just one of a set of technologies, of course, but digital technologies generally, I don't really think the church has leveraged these fully. And maybe now as churches are like integrating these technologies into into kind of their institutions and their institutional life, maybe there is an opportunity for that.
I just feel like if I can wrap it up maybe this comment, it's just
sure.
It's felt like the majority of churches, and Pastor Dave, you can tell me otherwise, or even Michael too for your church. It felt like the majority of churches, the way that they served others or delivered value to people it wasn't just mission. It wasn't like we have a specific mission that we're achieving, because that's like business. Like remote business works. A lot of business can do that, where we have a task, we coordinate, collaborate, people get paid, and we achieve the result. It felt like churches were far more like communities, like social groups. Like people are coming for the other people. They're not really necessarily coming just for the mission or just for the good content or anything. They're just coming for the people. And that makes it that much harder, I think, with this transition, because the value of the people, you kind of get the experience of the people is much easier to receive in person, unless they're already all digital natives, the way Pastor Davey talked about your wife, right? When you're meeting each other in the game world, it makes complete sense. You can connect so deeply even there, and talk about what you guys are doing together and have a mission in the game and connect about life outside of the game. But it seems like that is one of the more challenging aspects of this transition for churches. It's almost like letting go of the old way that people got value out of their community and having to adopt a new one. But if it goes hybrid, it's going to be tempting just to try to go back to the old one and give up the new stuff. And there's no, the bridging between the two is complicated. I've just probably got more questions than answers, but yeah.
Yeah, I find that community is the catchword for most churchgoers, and that's what I hear a lot. Like, I go to this church for the community, or I miss community. Or even it doesn't matter how well the pastor preaches or how good the worship team is. I go for the people. I go for the community. So I think that is a big factor. And also, I mean, if you think about the immigrant church, church is so much more than just, worshiping together. It's the connections, it's a business, networking, it's a safe place, from the world out there.
Pastor Dave, would you say that in the communities that your wife is in, do you think that they are also searching for community? Is that what most gamers are going for in your view?
Definitely, I would definitely say
See the
so.
parallels there.
Yeah, because sometimes I'm late at night and there's just one other person, and it's that awkward guy. Like, I kind of want to play with you. I don't want to look too lonely. But like, there's something about having that common ground, or like doing something together, a mission, even if it's like virtual, that makes it okay, to be together.
Well, thank you, everyone, for this interesting discussion, and some great questions for us to think about moving forward.
Yeah. All right. Thanks. Thank you, Pastor Dave. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Daniel. And thanks to our listeners, watchers, for just being part of this. We are going to have a forum thread open with these questions that you can visit and put your thoughts into. You can put your comments. You can also comment on the YouTube video when this comes out. But these are questions that we're going to be figuring out together. So we'd love to have your input on that and just sharing what you're learning as you're trying to navigate this in your communities as well. And I'm hopeful that this idea of like gamer communities, tech communities, academic communities, like there's something there, and if our churches become a space for people to have multiple communities that they belong to, that could be really, really interesting. So please share what communities you're part of as well. All right. Thanks, everybody. Until next time.